Imagine boarding a plane with your loved ones, excited for a long-awaited vacation, only to feel the sting of unfair treatment the moment you step on board. That's exactly what happened to the Johnson family, a kind-hearted black couple traveling with their young daughter. As they settled into their seats, they were met with icy stares and harsh words from a flight attendant who seemed determined to single them out. Tension filled the cabin as passengers whispered and exchanged uncomfortable glances. The situation escalated when the flight attendant demanded the family leave the plane, leaving everyone stunned. But just as the Johnsons prepared to leave, something unexpected happened, something that turned the entire flight upside down. What was their secret? And how did it manage to shock not just the flight crew, but everyone on board? Stay tuned, because this story is one you won't want to miss. As the Johnson family hesitated, the flight attendant's tone grew sharper, drawing even more attention from the other passengers. Whispers spread quickly through the cabin. Some people seemed confused, others visibly uncomfortable. What did they do wrong? A voice muttered nearby, but no one dared to confront the situation. The young daughter clung to her mother's arm, her wide eyes darting between the flight attendant and the growing crowd of onlookers. Just when it seemed the family had no choice but to comply, Mr. Johnson calmly stood up and said something no one expected. His words were steady but carried an undeniable weight, leaving the flight attendant momentarily speechless. Passengers leaned forward, trying to catch every word. Slowly, the tension in the air shifted, and all eyes were now on the Johnsons. Who were they really? And why did their quiet strength begin to change everything? The flight attendant's initial shock quickly gave way to a defensive stance. She folded her arms and shot back. "This is a safety matter. If you won't comply, I'll have to call security." The passengers murmured louder now, their unease growing. A man sitting a few rows back shook his head and muttered, "This doesn't feel right," while a woman near the front reached for her phone, seemingly ready to record. Meanwhile, Mrs. Johnson, holding her daughter tightly, softly said, "We're not here to cause trouble. We just want to take our trip like everyone else." Her voice carried a quiet dignity that only added to the mystery surrounding the family. Before the situation could escalate further, a business-class passenger stood up and called out, "You can't treat people like this." This unexpected ally turned the focus of the crowd again, leaving the tension on the plane razor-sharp. What was really going on here? The flight attendant froze for a moment, clearly taken aback by the passenger's bold interruption. "Sir, I need you to remain seated," she said firmly, though her voice wavered slightly. But the man wasn't backing down. "You're singling them out, and we all see it," he replied, his voice ringing with conviction. A ripple of agreement spread through the cabin as more passengers began to murmur in support. The Johnsons remained calm, but the tension in the air was almost unbearable. Little by little, others started to speak up, questioning why the family was being targeted. The flight attendant looked increasingly flustered, her authority beginning to falter under the weight of the passengers' growing unity. Then, just as it seemed like the situation couldn't get any more intense, Mr. Johnson reached into his bag and pulled out something that made the entire cabin fall silent. Every eye was locked on him, waiting to see what would happen next. As Mr. Johnson slowly lifted the object from his bag, a wave of curiosity rippled through the cabin. The passengers leaned in, their curiosity mixed with unease. In his hand was a neatly folded document, its edges worn as if it had been carried for years. He opened it carefully and spoke with calm authority. "This is a letter from the airline's CEO, commending me for my contributions to aviation safety. I'm a retired pilot who spent over 20 years flying planes like this one." Gasps filled the cabin. The flight attendant's face turned pale, her confidence visibly crumbling. Before she could respond, Mrs. Johnson added softly, "And that's not all. We're also here on a mission to support underprivileged families through the airline's community program. We were invited by the company itself." The passengers erupted in murmurs, their frustration now directed at the flight attendant. But just when it seemed the truth would settle the conflict, another unexpected figure stepped forward, a senior crew member who had been quietly observing. "Wait," they said firmly, their expression unreadable. "There's more to this situation than you realize." The senior crew member stepped forward, their gaze shifting between the flight attendant and the Johnsons. "I've been monitoring this situation, and it's clear there's been a misunderstanding," they began. "But before we go any further, I need to confirm something with Mr. Johnson." The cabin fell silent, the tension thick as everyone waited for what would come next. The crew member extended a hand toward Mr. Johnson. "You're Captain Johnson, aren't you? The man who once saved an entire flight during an emergency landing." The murmurs turned to audible gasps. Passengers exchanged stunned looks as Mr. Johnson nodded humbly. "Yes, that's me," he replied, his voice steady. The senior crew member turned to the flight attendant, their tone stern. "This family is not only respected by this airline, but by the entire aviation community. Your actions today are unacceptable." The flight attendant's face turned bright red as the weight of their mistake sank in. Just as the passengers began to applaud, Mr. Johnson raised a hand. "This isn't about punishment or anger," he said, addressing the crowd. "It's about making sure everyone is treated with respect, on the ground or in the air." His words carried a gravity that silenced the room, leaving everyone deep in thought. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the Johnson family remained seated, greeted with warm smiles and quiet gratitude from passengers around them. But as the plane began to taxi, the senior crew member whispered something into Mr. Johnson's ear. His eyebrows lifted in surprise, and he smiled. Whatever they said, it was clear this journey was far from ordinary, and the Johnson story had only just begun. As the plane climbed into the sky, a sense of calm returned to the cabin. Passengers exchanged small smiles with the Johnson family, many offering quiet words of support as they passed by. The flight attendant, clearly shaken, approached the Johnsons with a heartfelt apology. Mrs. Johnson accepted it graciously, her warmth reminding everyone of the power of compassion, even in tense moments. Later in the flight, the senior crew member stopped by their seats again, revealing that the airline planned to honor the Johnsons for their contributions to the community and aviation. The announcement brought a round of applause from the passengers, and even the young daughter beamed with pride. By the time they landed, the Johnsons weren't just seen as passengers, they were a symbol of grace under pressure. As they walked off the plane, Mr. Johnson's final words lingered with everyone. "Kindness can change everything."